Hello and welcome back. Today, something a bit different on my world of stuff. I'm not going to review anything. I'm not going to open anything up. I'm not going to discuss anything in terms of TV or film or books or physical media. Today, though, I'm going to talk about something that's probably quite important to all of us. That's why we're all here. I'm going to talk about television and the future of British television. Hello, welcome back to my world of stuff. My name is Paul Mutt. I hope you're all keeping really well. The weather's getting a little bit chilly, winter draws on and all that. If you are new here, if you're new to this channel, you may well be. Why not think about liking and subscribing? That would be a marvellous thing to do. Lots of stuff here, physical media updates, unboxings, TV, film reviews, retrospectives, all the good stuff this year. So why not think about liking and subscribing by clicking there or scanning that QR code with your phone to join me and all my chums in this fabulous world of entertainment. So today I'm talking about the future of British television as we know it and if it has a future, and just pondering some of the issues and the problems that linear television faces in the 21st century with the rise of streaming and downloading and catch-up services. Linear television is on the back foot and is at risk in ways it never has been before. And I just thought I would talk about it and canvass some ideas and thoughts and opinions from you guys. It's a contentious issue, particularly when it comes to talk about the BBC, which is where I think most of my concerns lie as a fan or supporter of the BBC, because I know that the BBC's financial position is very controversial. The BBC is supported by a license fee, which is in theory paid by everyone in the country who owns a television. And that's how the BBC creates its output, its TV shows, its radio, its internet presence, its news service. Everything that the BBC does is funded by people like me who pay my TV license. And that's become a very contentious issue lately. And in discussing that later on, I hope that we can have a discussion that isn't peppered in the comment section by defund the BBC, the BBC's crap, BBC's full of pedos, BBC is biased. Those are best left in the comments of the right-wing press, particularly the Daily Mail, which has its own agenda against the BBC. So I'm hoping that we can talk about British television and its future and how it's funded, particularly for the BBC, without all that vitriol and anger spilling out. It's a difficult ask, I know, because it's a subject that people are passionate about. And certainly the BBC has its own issues in terms of its governance and its response to controversies and the mistakes that are inevitably made in an organisation as huge as the BBC. Before we do all that, let's just wind back and consider the British TV landscape such as it is at the moment. British TV has been dominated, I would say, for the last 100 years by the BBC, British Broadcasting Corporation, public broadcast service that was established back in the 1920s. It was actually founded in October 1922, first of all as a radio service. Primitive TV service started up in the 1930s, and in 1955 ITV, independent television, was set up as a commercial rival to the BBC. And where the BBC had, for the first 3 decades of its existence, had pretty much a monopoly on providing audio and visual entertainment for the British public, now it's had competition, massive competition, because whereas the BBC, I think, has always had, and still has to an extent, this slightly stuffy persona, informed by the mantra of its first Director General, Lord Reith, who said that the BBC should always strive to inform, educate and entertain. And I think that's something which has hung heavy about the BBC for decades, even since the inception of ITV. ITV being more commercial, it was very much driven by ratings and by people who watched it. And for the first few years of its existence, it really hammered the BBC because they were creating entertainment shows and popular comedies and dramas. Things like Coronation Street, they for decades dominated the TV ratings, although its own dominance has slipped a lot in the last few years. So ITV, being a more commercial proposition, was providing the shows that the BBC, which was still hidebound by those Reithian values, wasn't quite able to keep up with. BBC was still very much characterised by middle-aged older men in suits, very stuffy and very stuck in their ways and very resistant to things that were rapidly modernising in the world of TV. BBC eventually changed its ways in the 60s. New people came along, people like, for example, Sidney Newman, who had worked on Canadian television and worked for the ABC in the UK. And he came along and started to blow some of the cobwebs away from the BBC and commercialise it a bit more without it ever being commercial. The issue, of course, is that ITV is funded by the commercials that it runs in between ad breaks in its shows. And the BBC isn't. BBC is funded by the licence payer, and that's always been the difference. But things have been happening in the last few years which have changed quite a lot of the way British people watch television. It all began, I suppose, 1982 saw the arrival of Channel 4, which was the first new non-BBC or ITV channel for some time. In the 1960s, BBC had branched out and created BBC Two, a slightly more highbrow version of BBC One, the more populist of the BBC's channels. Channel 4 came along in 1982 with a commission to be slightly edgier and a bit more daring, which I think it was for some time. Channel 5 arrived in the 1990s. And of course, also in the 1990s, we had the arrival of non-terrestrial television with the likes of Sky and B-Sky B. They started dipping their toes in the water, but none of this really had a massive impact on British TV because I think the public was still turning to the BBC and ITV for their entertainment. And eventually, the ratings battle between the two settled, and it became not exactly 50-50, but I think the ITV and the BBC were both fulfilling their remits under the charter for the BBC and as a commercial network for ITV. Things have changed over the last few years, as I mentioned, with the arrival and the proliferation of streaming services, Netflix, Amazon, Apple, Paramount, Disney. All these streaming services are now extremely popular in the UK, and they are, and have been for some time, chipping away at linear television. They are offering alternatives to people who don't feel satisfied by what's on the main networks. And as we know, many of these channels are massively well funded, and they're able to create these huge dramas and huge productions which are way beyond the scope of traditional broadcasters in the UK. And they have, as a result, been tempting people away from linear television. Linear television has become seen as old-fashioned. Youngsters don't want to watch the BBC or ITV. They will watch YouTube or TikTok or Amazon or Netflix if they're going to watch anything of long form. They're really not particularly tuned into the BBC or ITV. And things have been coming to a head, I think, in the past few months. We've seen over the last few years, and I've talked about it here, the decline of viewing figures, ratings in the UK. British television always used to judge the success of its programmes by the overnight viewing figures. It gave you an idea of how many people were watching a programme. Once catch-up services, like particularly the BBC's excellent iPlayer, came into existence, that became less important. BBC became more concerned with the reach of programmes over a longer period of time. ITV eventually managed to get their ITV Hub up and running. There's still some issues with that, I've noticed, in terms of what's available and what's not and so on. But BBC and ITV have these catch-up services now, and overnight viewing figures don't really matter anymore. But even linear viewing figures, when you look at the figures that are collated after 7 days or 28 days, they are showing that less and less people are watching linear television. I mentioned the once predominant soap opera genre, Coronation Street, which once could command audiences of 20 million plus, now gets 4 million viewers if it's lucky. The BBC's alternative EastEnders, again, another massive rating success in its day, now barely gets 3 million viewers after 7 days of catch-up. And the same applies to all long-running series. Casualty, the BBC's medical drama, can pull in 3 million viewers on a good night. So linear TV viewing is down but not out. We still see that linear television is able to create those must-see moments, water cooler moments. Recently we've had the Celebrity Traitors, which is not my cup of tea by any means, but that pulled in viewing figures of around 14 million. I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here on ITV gets about 6 million. Strictly Come Dancing on BBC gets between 7 and 8 million, and Christmas Time was a massive triumph for the BBC last year with a hugely successful Wallace and Gromit film and the finale of Gavin and Stacey, which ultimately pulled in 21 million viewers. So I think linear television isn't dead, but it's under threat and it's in danger. And I think it's in danger partly because of the fact that younger people aren't watching it, and that's an issue that they have to come to terms with somehow. And older viewers are dying off. People who used to watch Coronation Street, I suppose that show's audience is fading away, and it's hard to imagine too many young people were jumping on board a series that's been around since 1960. So linear TV is on the back foot. It's down, as I said, but it's not out. But there are risks which have become quite obvious in the last few weeks, which is one of the reasons I decided to do this video, just to chat about these issues. ITV itself is at risk, and it has admitted fairly recently, I'm reading from some notes of mine here, it is in preliminary discussions to sell its broadcasting business to Sky for £1.6 billion, a move that could reshape the UK's television landscape. The talks focus on ITV's media and entertainment division, which includes the free-to-air TV channels as well as the ITVX streaming service. The discussions with Sky, which is owned by US-based Comcast, come as the television industry faces fierce competition from streaming services such as Netflix and Disney. The deal would not include ITV's production arm, ITV Studios, which makes programs like, and they quote as examples, Love Island and I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here. Is this the best ITV can offer? However, one analyst said the broadcaster could lose those shows if the deal goes through, as the channel would have to bid alongside rival companies for the contracts, despite ITV being the biggest customer presence. Tom Harrington from Enders Analysis is quoted as saying it would be unlikely for current shows to leave ITV as there will already be agreements in place, but splitting the two businesses could make it less likely for new shows to appear on ITV. Comcast, which owns Universal Studios, bought Rupert Murdoch's Sky in 2018 and is a major player in the US media sector. That's an interesting development in that it means that we could see the end of ITV as we know it. Now, this video is going to focus on the BBC when I get to it, because I am a supporter of the BBC. I must make that clear. It's not so much I'm a fan of the BBC, but I'm a supporter of the ethos and idea of the BBC. ITV, being more commercial, has never appealed to me in the same way. However, during the 60s and 70s, ITV, as a random series of networks working together in various regions to create TV shows, was pretty much unstoppable, creating dramas and comedies and documentaries that served the whole ITV network. That changed a few years back when the regional franchises were all closed and ITV became this great conglomerate that makes programs for the ITV network. And I do feel that its imagination has been sucked out slightly, and it does rely on certain what they consider to be tentpole titles and safe procedural dramas that appeal to ITV's homeland audience rather than trying to branch out and do something a bit different. So what happens to ITV isn't quite as much of concern to me, although it is of concern because it's further erosion of the bedrock of what we understand British television and British television culture to be. What's more concerning, however, to me is the BBC, the position with the BBC. There are so many issues surrounding the BBC. I could probably do a series of videos here about it, but I won't do that. I'll just focus on the things that have happened recently to suggest that the BBC will struggle to maintain itself as we know it today. Now, the BBC, as I've said, is supported by the licence fee. It's about £155 a year. Personally, I consider that extremely good value for what the BBC offers. And I'm not somebody who watches a lot of BBC content. I appreciate the stuff that's on the iPlayer. And again, with the move away from linear schedules to catch up, there's no real essential to sit and watch a programme when it's on. One of the few shows I watch when it's live is Doctor Who, because that's part of my DNA, and I like to watch Doctor Who when it's on, even when, with the now defunct Disney deal, episodes would debut at like 8 o'clock in the morning. I would watch them on broadcast because that's when I feel connected most to the show, when I'm watching it and I know other people are watching it at the same time. So I don't watch a lot of linear BBC stuff. Occasionally there will be certain things that I will watch, but I very much rely on catch-up to watch the shows that I do watch. And there are a handful of BBC shows I'm watching at the moment on catch-up services. I also use BBC Radio quite a lot. Radio 2 if I'm at home during the day or out and about in the car. Radio 2 is on. I think Radio 2 is a terrific service. It's the most popular radio station in Europe for good reason. And occasionally I'll dip into Sounds for a podcast or a catch-up of a radio show. There's only so many hours of the day to catch up with all these things. So I am a big supporter of what the BBC provides, and I think that £3-4 a week is a small price to pay for what's available. Whether you choose to watch or listen to it or not, the fact that it's available and is there for you is the massive selling point that the BBC has to justify its existence. As I mentioned, there's huge resistance to the licence fee, and there may be many of you out here watching this video who will be fuming at the thought of a licence fee, which is often called by very angry people a TV tax. People have this strange hatred of the idea of being forced to pay for something, and people often very proudly boast, I don't watch the BBC, I shouldn't have to pay for it. And I understand that, and my argument to that always is, well, why don't you watch the BBC? What's the issue with people refusing to watch the nation's 100-year-old broadcaster? The heritage that the BBC has, the history that it has, the archives that it has, everything that goes with the BBC. I can't understand why people stubbornly don't want to access it. And I do think that the BBC is the last real bastion of culture that we have in this country, which is why I get frustrated when it gets under attack. But it does get under attack, and there are times when the BBC is its own worst enemy. It's endured any number of scandals over the last few years alone. They're constantly under more scrutiny than any other broadcaster because we pay for it. I understand that. BBC has to justify its existence. It has to justify the things it does. It has to explain and account for the things that go wrong. And this is where the BBC's main problems lie, of course, that things happen and fingers are pointed, and as the public broadcaster, the BBC is held to account, and it does have to explain how things happen, but it does seem to keep tripping over its own feet. The scandals are endless, and the controversies are endless. We go back to things like the Jimmy Savile stuff from the 60s and 70s and the horrors of the things that he is alleged to have done. More recently, we had Hugh Edwards, the newsreader, a massively trusted public figure who turned out to be something less than that. Scandals involving various TV shows, outrages that happen, faux pas that are made, and people's behaviour is under more scrutiny than ever before. Most recently, we've had again scandals to do with the MasterChef host Greg Wallace and his co-host John Turreau. They're both sacked, and the BBC are forced into the position of apologising for the behaviour, often not on television, of its staff. And this is the problem for the BBC. It's always on the back foot. It's always having to apologise for things that are happening. There have been various scandals in relation to contestants on Strictly Come Dancing who've done certain things, who've behaved certain ways that have offended, let's face it, a minority of the people and the right-wing press who really want to have a go at the BBC. And they will use anything they can, anything to get their hands on, to have a pop at the BBC. And I say in this, trying not to sound like somebody who is an apologist for the BBC, because yes, they make mistakes, they do stupid things. Sometimes I do think that the things they apologise for are things that they should perhaps be saying, well, we apologise if people were offended by this. We are very sorry to hear that people didn't like that. However, we stand by the editorial decision that was made to broadcast a show or a drama or stand by talent that says something off script. I think the BBC is too keen to sort of apologise and go down on bended knee and don sackcloth and ashes and apologise for everything because they are on the back foot. The charter that funds the BBC is up for renewal in a couple of years' time, and people are looking very closely at the way the BBC pays for what it gives us, the programmes and output that it creates. This has all come to a massive head, of course, in the most recent scandal regarding the Panorama incident from an episode that was shown, I think, last year, where footage of Donald Trump was edited in a way that reflected negatively against Donald Trump. It's hard to imagine anybody doing such a thing, but it was a massive editorial wrong step by the BBC in allowing this documentary to be tampered with in this way, this footage to be tampered with, to create this new scandal, which is a threat to the BBC. I don't think it's as massively a threat as it is purported to be. President Trump is threatening to sue the BBC for anywhere between $1 billion and $5 billion. I don't think that's going anywhere for various reasons, but it's just another existential threat to our national broadcaster. So I don't know what the answer is in terms of where the BBC goes. ITV will continue somewhere or another in a different form. But my concern is more about the BBC, as I keep saying it, a supporter of the BBC and what it stands for. Perhaps not so much what it is. I understand it's made missteps and it's misjudged certain things quite badly. I think there's a problem with senior management. Tim Davie, the Director General, resigned from the BBC a couple of weeks ago in the wake of the growing Trump Panorama scandal. And I think the problem for the BBC, it doesn't have strong management anymore. Back in the 60s and 70s, you'd hear about the DG, people like Marmaduke Hussey and Bill Cotton, these strong, forceful characters who helped shape and steer the BBC. They don't seem to be there anymore. There seem to be career broadcasters who step in and take over for a little while, and then when things get hot, they step aside. I mean, Tim Davie was caught in the middle of this huge argument and row about Panorama and resigned. And Deborah Turness, the chief executive officer of BBC News, resigned around the same time. Two fairly major, important figureheads for the BBC jumped ship when the waters got choppy. I understand the reasons that they did that, however. The charter renewal is coming up, and possibly both of these executives, feeling themselves and their reputations damaged by these scandals, felt that they weren't perhaps the best people to be leading the charge for however the BBC is to be funded, whether it's by the charter or something else. But then it puts the corporation in a difficult position with those discussions due to start very soon. There's nobody experienced there to dig their heels in and argue the BBC's case. And of course, we have the ongoing threat of streaming services and what they represent and how they have been and still are constantly chipping away at linear television. I think that's a second major issue that the BBC has to face. The streaming services aren't going away. I do think that they will flatten out and level out. There are so many streaming services at the moment. And again, this is one thing that slightly frustrates me when people say they don't want to pay £3 a week for the BBC, when they're pumping out £10, £15 a month on Sky and Amazon and Netflix and Paramount and Disney. And that's just a streaming service. The BBC provides more than that. The BBC provides news, whatever you think of any biases it may have. It provides information that bonds the country together. So linear television is under threat from all sides. It's hard to think where it's going to go. I wonder where it'll be in 5 years, 10 years' time. Will we still have linear schedules? Will they exist anymore? Will the BBC become a streaming service? Will the BBC become a subscription service? What will happen to ITV? Will ITV become this nebulous service that just offers a handful of established shows that the new owners of ITV have faith in and that they know will bring in a certain number of viewers and a certain number of commercial advertisers? For the BBC, the choice is harder because they are funded by us, and a lot of us aren't happy with that and don't want to have to pay for the BBC. That's the bottom line, and that's an increasing problem for the BBC because we hear constantly how people are cancelling their TV licenses, focusing purely on the streaming services. And I think that's a shame, and I think that the BBC should be supported, because not just because it's always been there. Things that have always been there don't have to be there. Things can become obsolete. But I think the BBC is a long way from becoming obsolete. And luckily, I think we have a culture secretary in the current government, if they're still around in 2027, that seems broadly supportive of the BBC. And she recently stated that she was quite keen to find a way to support the BBC so that it is funded well enough to keep providing the services that it currently does. In terms of high-end drama, it needs to compete with the sort of shows that are being made by the streaming services, which do have, it appears, bottomless pits of cash. So the BBC needs to be funded, and this government seems to be sympathetic towards that. How you fund it, that could be a whole other video. Whether it becomes a subscription service, whether the government should make an allowance from taxation towards it, it's a massively contentious issue. The one thing it won't be, however, is commercialised. A lot of people, and I see it on Facebook forums and in comment sections all the time, it's time the BBC took commercials on like everyone else does. Yes, everyone else does. That's why they don't want the BBC to do it, because they know that the pot of advertising money is dropping and a lot of channels are struggling to stay alive because that slice of pie is shrinking. And most of these broadcasters that operate from money from advertisers know that if the BBC is forced to be commercialised, advertisers will flock to the BBC. One, because it's the BBC. Two, because it has shows that they know are the place to put their adverts. So nobody in the commercial TV network wants BBC to be commercialised, because it would be the death knell for many commercial channels, some of the smaller channels which just about get by. So making the BBC commercial isn't the way. I'm not incredibly intimately familiar with the Charter, but I know it has certain restrictions on the way the BBC can make money from its products. BBC makes money from shows which goes back into the BBC pot. And I've said this before in relation to things like Doctor Who, which is always an issue with me, obviously. But with Doctor Who now freed from Disney, BBC will need to find a way to fund it if it is to go forward. Whether that means going on another streamer or funding it themselves. But I've always said that certainly something like Doctor Who, which is a big international title, making a lot of profit to the BBC, some of that money should go back to fund more episodes of that programme. Whether it's all of that money or some of it, it should always have the budget it needs because it can fund itself. There is so much Doctor Who merchandise, Blu-rays, books, comics, toys, all the Doctor Who stuff that you can get hold of. It's all licensed by the BBC. They get a cut from it. That should go back into the BBC's coffers to pay for more Doctor Who. I think the BBC's commercialisation should be in the way it projects itself and sells its wares, whether it's just its programmes being sold to broadcasters or whether it's various bits of merchandise and ephemera. Perhaps they could look more into that sort of thing to generate more money. Just vague issues. That's as far as it's going to go in terms of the commercialisation of the BBC. So there we are. This has all been extremely random. I didn't structure any of this. I never like to structure my videos. I like to go in broadly knowing what I'm going to talk about when I'm doing retrospectives and so on. But this is such a huge topic about the future of British television, the future of linear television. Is there a future in a schedule of television programmes? 7 o'clock, 7:30, 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, you've got these programmes where you can just tune into a catch-up service and watch these programmes very often before they're even broadcast. BBC and ITV now on their respective catch-up services will have full series available before the first one has been broadcast or after the first episode has been broadcast. So you don't have to wait for the linear screening. Does linear television matter anymore on any other day except Christmas Day? Does it have a future? It is hard to think that in 10 years' time, people will be sitting down to watch EastEnders at 8:30 in the evening. It seems archaic. It's something I'm familiar with. I've grown up with it and I've lived with it. I don't use it very often, but it would be a shame if linear television died, and it would be a tragedy if the BBC died. So all those people out there, and some of you may well be watching this, were doing the hashtag defund the BBC thing or screaming that the BBC is full of pedos. It isn't, by the way. No more than any other organisation. Do you think the BBC is the only place that has inadvertently employed people with certain tendencies? I don't think so. But the BBC gets the attraction and the attention because we pay for it, and that's always going to be a weakness. And I think if the BBC can find another way to fund itself to the level it's at now, perhaps it would be in a stronger position to stand up for itself a bit more, to say, well, sorry you're offended, but, tough, which I think they should do for certain rather trivial things that they're accused of. So there we are. I'd love to know what you think of all this, where you think linear TV is going. Do you care if the BBC dies? I think it's a shame if you don't, because BBC always used to be called, back in the 70s, particularly and into the 80s, Auntie Beeb. And that's what I think of when I think of the BBC. I think of the BBC as the broadcaster you turn to at times of great national events. We see it now, at times of crisis or when something of national importance happens or there's a ceremony or something happens. People will watch on the BBC, but for all its faults and for all the criticism it rightly receives on occasion, it is the broadcaster people will go to when big things happen. And I would hate that to go. Where do we think we're going with the BBC and ITV? I would be interested to hear your comments. I'd rather it wasn't, the hashtag defund the BBC stuff, because that's not very helpful. I'd like some sort of constructive comments. Do you think that the BBC should take on commercials? Do you think it could fund itself more in a commercial way? Do you think that it could be paid for by deductions from our taxes? There are lots of different options. I'm sure all these will be considered in the coming year or so before the charter renewal in 2027. But I think it is quite positive that the government is broadly supportive of the BBC. But I also think it's very important that the BBC gets its house in order and gets its cards back in the pack and gets the right people, strong people, corporation people who believe in the BBC and will stand up and defend it and not collapse when things get rough. So we need those strong people to emerge. And I don't know who those people are, and I'm not connected to the industry. I don't know who's out there. I don't know who the front runners might be to take over as Director General. But it's got to be somebody with a very firm and positive view of the BBC, somebody who believes in the BBC and wants to fight for it. So there we are. That's where we are. Terrestrial TV is under threat from streamers. It's under threat from itself. It's under threat from the 21st century. And I do wonder where it's going to go. And I would love to hear your comments. As I said, keep them constructive if you can. If you're just going to post BBC is pedos, that comment is never going to appear. So try to resist that if you can. And I suspect you will, because I think that my subscribers, you're a very intelligent, bright lot, and I don't think you would necessarily be compelled to go down that line. I think we get a good dialogue going. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on the BBC and ITV. As I say, I know there's a lot of anger about the BBC. People do get angry about the BBC because they do regard their licence as a tax, and they don't watch it, and they don't like what's been happening, and the BBC has become its own worst enemy. But you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. You maybe clear the bathwater or replace the bathwater and do something worthwhile with it. I think the BBC has a massive place in British culture, and it would be a shame to see it destroyed. I can't imagine that anybody wants to actually physically destroy the concept of the BBC, but undoubtedly changes need to be made, and it needs to realign itself and reset its priorities and the way it presents itself for the future. So leave a comment down below. It'd be great to hear from you. Before I go, I'm just going to mention a new book, Talking to Television, slightly lighter mode. This book arrived, which I ordered this week, published by 10 Acre Books. It's not a sponsor. I bought this myself and I'm going to read it. Just started it. It's by Richard Marson. It's called Box of Delights. Richard Marson is a former editor of Blue Peter, and he has written some fantastic biographies in the past of John Nathan Turner, Doctor Who's producer in the 1980s, Biddy Baxter, who's the editor of Blue Peter for millions of years, and Verity Lambert, the first producer of Doctor Who. He writes fantastically detailed, entertaining, not dry books. And this book is about 500 pages odd, looking at the history of BBC children's television from 1967, when the children's department was reinstated after having been dumped a few years before. And it goes through the glory days of that era of British children's TV, looking at dramas and entertainment shows that were made at Television Centre and beyond at that time. It looks like a terrific read. I've read the first chapter or so yesterday. It's a great book. So if you're interested in getting hold of this, pop over to 10 Acre Books website, find yourself a copy of Box of Delight. It could be perfect Christmas reading. Right, thank you for watching this slightly overlong video. Do apologise for that. And I know it's been a bit all over the place, as so many of my videos are, but I just wanted to voice my concern and my opinions of some of these issues facing the broadcasting landscape in the UK. So please leave a comment and don't forget to like and subscribe. I will see you soon. Until I do, keep taking the stuff.